Hey there, I'm Lindsay, creator of Mrs. Project, where we talk schedules and project management. Today's topic is,
what is your critical path and how to find it? So what is your critical path? It is the longest duration, unbroken path from your time now to the project end. And because of this is why your logic in your schedule is so important to find that longest path. So when you take the PMP exam, you're going to be giving a chart like this that shows just the data. And your first thing that you need to do is to create a network diagram with this information. It's going to list all the activities, how long each one of them is, and then the relationships. So what is that predecessor to each task? And in this situation, we put in some lags. I will discuss later what my feelings are about lags. So to build that network diagram, we're first going to show, okay, activity A is the first one. There's no predecessor. So we're going to create a box for activity A. We'll look at B. B says it is dependent on A, so we're going to make that be after A in the same line. But then we also see that C is also dependent on A, so we're going to put the box down below B, still to the right of A. Then we're going to show the connections between those. So A drives the start of B and C. Now, where does D fall in this? D is right after C, so we're putting it right next to it and drawing that arrow. And then we have E. E is after D and B. And it's actually also after G, but we haven't gotten to G yet. So I'm going to put E all the way out here over to the right. Then I'm going to make those arrows to say D is a predecessor to E, and so is B. Now here's where F is. F is after C. So I'm going to put that down below with D, because both D and F are dependent on C. So I'm going to make that arrow. And then we have G that's right after F, and creating that arrow. And then you see that also E was dependent on G as well. So there you go. So here we have 3 paths to get to E. So now we're going to find out which is the longest unbroken path. But to do this, we're going to add the durations of each task on here. Because right now you would think that A, C, F, G, E is the longest path just by looking at it. But now we need to add the durations. So we have 7 for A, 12 for B, 8 for C, 5 for D, but there's a 2-day lag in there, 2 for E, 2 for F, and 3 for G. Now I'm going to go back to my comment earlier when I said how I feel about lags. The PMP exam might have lags on there, and so if you do, you just have to honor it, and that's why I am teaching you this way. But how I feel with lags is if you know why there's a lag, put it as a task. Don't put a lag in there, because that helps you manage your project better than having all these tasks that have lags in them. DCMA will say that 5% of your tasks can have lags, but it's just best practice just to not include them. Just try to make it where if you know what that lag is and what it represents, put it as a task to track. Now we're going to calculate what the paths are. How many durations are they? So the first one, we're adding the 7 to 12, the 2, it gets to 21. The next path, we're going to add the 7, 8, 2, 5, and 2, and that gets us to 24. The third path, we're going to add the 7, don't forget the 8 in C, 2, 3, and 2, and that gets us to 22. So by this definition, the longest path would be 24. So that is your critical path, is getting from A to C to D to E. Now, the next part is you want to talk about what float you have. This is also a calculation that you will do. And the float or slack means that that's the time you have before a task impacts another task. Now, there's also total slack and free slack, and we'll get into that. But right now, just the word slack and float means it's the time you have before it impacts another task. So we're going to calculate that float. So with your critical path, that's 0. You have 0 float because if you move any one of those, so if A increases to 8 days duration, then it impacts C, which impacts D, which impacts E. So your critical path is impacted no matter what. So that is why it is a 0-day float. And that's how you would use it in project. You would look at your total slack column, and any task that has 0 is on the critical path. For this first one, how many days do we have? Well, it's the difference between the 24 and the 21, so that's a 3. So if you were to say if task B grew by 3 days, then it would be on the critical path. So that's how much slack it has. And then with the third path, you would do 24 minus 22, and that gets you the 2 days of float. So you have 2 days before it impacts. So it could grow, any one of those tasks could grow by 2 days before it became on the critical path. This is what your network diagram looks like when you build it in Project. So this is a Gantt version of the network design. And you can see that there is logic everywhere. We've listed the task over to the left with the durations. We can ignore the dates for right now, but then you have the predecessors. And so all those are still just the same as our network diagram that we had. But here you can visually see it, because before it was just boxes and they had numbers in it. This gets you a better visual representation. So we could click on up at the top to say highlight the critical task, and it's going to show us that middle one. The A, C, D, and E is the critical path because it is unbroken. That is the longest path to get to E. But then you can also see the other task of the float. So Project has the column total slack, and that's where you can see those numbers that we had put on our other chart. So here was the 3 days of slack to say this is before it impacts. So if I wanted to increase this, and I'm going to show this first. So if I wanted to increase this by 3 days, it took away the slack. It is now on the critical path. And because they equal each other, they're both on the critical path. So either one could be the driver. So that's why you've got to watch them carefully. But if I increased it by just one more day, it now is the critical path. And then it gave the original critical path 1 day of slack, because now it's saying, okay, if you increase it by 1 day, then it'll be on the critical path again. So it's like a running race. Same with this third one. Its total slack is 3 days. So if I were to add it to the 6 days, then it would be on the critical path. If I added it to just one more day, it now is the critical path, and the other ones have the float. Now, one thing I wanted to point out that I didn't do before was that the total slack here, how it is for task G had 2, but also task F. This is because it goes backwards to where whatever that first one is, and it'll keep calculating backwards, that whole path has 2 days of slack. So maybe it's this one that adds the 2 days. Either which way, you can add it to either task, and that gets it onto the critical path. Now, looking at another project, this is just an example to show that there is no logic built into this schedule. So when I ask it to find my critical path for me, it just labeled this 1 because you have no network, no relationships between all these tasks to show how they work together. So that's why I said network logic was so important, is because you need to build that logic for a project to calculate a schedule. If you just have tasks in there with no relationships, they're not part of the schedule then. They're not part of the logic, and you need to make them be part of the logic. So Project's really good at finding your critical path for your entire project. But when you're building a schedule and managing a project, there's going to be interim checkpoints that you're going to put into your schedule to make sure you're on track. Sometimes your boss might want to know what the critical path is to one of those milestones. Here's how you would find that information. In this schedule, we have 3 projects all doing their own individual things and then combining as a system for a couple tests. And then those milestones that we have as checkpoints is we have initial operating capability and then final operating capability. Project does a good job at finding what the critical path is to the entire project. So if I turn that radio button on, it's going to tell me that project A is the critical path to get to the project completion, to our final operating capability. We need to be watching everything that is on project A. But that's not what's driving IOC. So I can turn on these task paths with the predecessors and successors. And when I click on initial operating capability, it's going to tell me what the driver is for that. And so you can see that it's saying that dark orange, which is project B, is the driver for IOC. So getting project B on time. So if project B were to slip with their contract and getting that first prototype and their testing, it would impact IOC. The others have slack. So you can see where project C has some slack and project A has some slack to get to that testing for IOC. But you'll notice though that project is still calculating the critical path to B to FOC. So it's not putting your project B on the critical path. So to get this, you could start by putting a deadline onto your initial capability to equal what the date is that it's finishing. So I'm going to put that 5/24, but that still doesn't work. what you've got to do is you've got to add slack to your final project end date. So to do this, adding a deadline doesn't work in this situation. I will add that and show. Putting a deadline calculates both critical paths, but if you only want to look at just the IOC. So this is good. It's showing the dual critical paths for both milestones. But if you wanted to just calculate the IOC one, you would put some slack to that end date. So go to your constraint type and say must finish on and go out just a little bit further. So we're going to pick 7/16. Doesn't have to be much, just a little. Give yourself some slack. It's going to ask you, yes. There you go. Now it is highlighting just the IOC critical path here. So if you wanted critical path to show up, but again, you don't need to do that. You can just turn on the task path and get those driving predecessors and come about the answer that way. However, if you're working with a third-party tool and you want it to spit out the critical path, this is how you would find that and make it where the tool could find it. Don't forget, when you are done finding your critical path for an interim milestone, to go back to that milestone, the end milestone that you have, and change it back to as soon as possible and saving it that way. This gets your critical path back to where it should be. If you want to, you can remove the deadlines that you also set. That's up to you how you want it to be. It's just a simple deletion, and there you go. But just remember to, once you run those what if drills and finding the critical path for an interim milestone, make sure you change back that slack that you put in.
Hope this helps you for today. Now go out there and flow cast those projects.